Welcome, everyone. I'm Somini Sengupta. I'm the international climate correspondent for the New York Times, which is the sponsor of this panel discussion. I am really delighted to welcome our panelists from all over the world. This is truly an international panel at the Edinburgh International Book Festival. From Costa Rica, joining us, Christiana Figueres. Christiana, of course, is a former head of the UN Climate Change Agency, and as such helped steer the very difficult negotiations that led to the landmark Paris Agreement in 2015. She's also the co-author with Tom Rivett-Carnac of the book, The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis. Next, joining us from Guam, where it is the middle of the night, Julian Uggan. He is many things. He is a lawyer and the brains behind Blue Ocean Law, which is a law firm that specializes in human rights and environmental justice cases in the Pacific. He's also a poet and an essayist and sometimes a gospel swinger if you follow his Twitter feed. And finally, from the southwest of England, Anne Pettifor. And Anne is an economist really best known for two things. First, for making the case for debt forgiveness for the world's poorest countries through the advocacy campaign Jubilee 2000. And she also is known for having predicted the 2008 financial crisis. She did not, however, by her own admission, predict the pandemic, but she came up with the most extraordinary term for the impact of the pandemic, and she calls it a shuddering, which is, I think, absolutely apt to frame our discussion today about climate change, which also makes many people shudder about the impact, the extraordinary impact. So welcome to all of you, and a big welcome to our audience. Please remember that you are free to pose our panelists a question in the Q&A box. We will take the last 15 minutes of our panel to address some of your questions. So I want to start with my extraordinary panelists with a lightning round of words. I want to throw out a couple of words and phrases to you and just hear what that brings up for you. What is the thing that it makes you think of in a word or a phrase? So the first one is climate change. Christiana?
Challenge, doable.
Julian?
The single greatest threat that the international community has ever faced, especially toward human rights.
Anne?
Shocks, but also hope.
The next one is net zero. Christiane?
Stabilization, justice, safety.
Julian?
Big as hell goal, but achievable with a hell of a lot of collaboration.
Anne?
Cop out because it defers so much pollution reduction over time. It pushes it forward onto future generations. So it's a cop out for me. I want zero.
Okay.
I want zero.
Build back better. Christiana, please.
Wrong. Build forward.
Julian?
Same. I think that's the wrong phrasing.
Anne?
Yeah, building is not what we need to do. Growing, I don't know, community, growing community rather than building.
Okay. And the last one is wealth. Christiana?
Social injustice still in the year 2020.
Wealth, Julian?
Problematic, for sure, and unequal, but I believe that we can expand how we think about wealth.
And Anne?
Well, for me, it's an obscenity, actually. Right now, the rate at which, Jeff Bezos and others are accumulating, not tens of billions, but
That's perfect.
Yeah, that's obscene.
We thank you for those very, very thoughtful words. When we talk about climate change, as you all know, we talk about temperature rise, we talk about mitigation, adaptation, we talk about policy measures, we talk about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. What we often don't talk about is the personal impact of climate change. I want to hear from each of you, what is the personal impact, whether to your physical lives, whether to your psychological lives? Is climate change personal for you? And shall we start with Anne and end with Christiana this time?
Yes, it is personal. It's personal because I have grandchildren. That's why it's personal. I just have to think of the future we've built for them, really. But it's also kind of painful. It's hard to face. It's really hard to face, and I spend quite a lot of time trying to not face it, really. Yeah, so that's turmoil, internal turmoil about that.
Julian?
Oh,
Is climate change personal?
absolutely. It's as close to us in the Pacific as our jugular vein. It couldn't be more personal. Are these lightning rounds, Christiana, or do we have time to really talk about it?
You can expand on this one. How is it personal for you?
Yeah. Can I just tell a very quick story?
Absolutely.
I remember being in COP23 in Bonn, actually, and passing the Pacific Civil Society tents. And I remember one of the negotiators sort of arguing, actually sort of chiding and scolding a Pacific Island activist, talking about, like they don't understand the exact science of the degrees. And I remember thinking, honestly, this is for Pacific Islander people. I mean, basically it's the inundated need no instruction in inundation. Really, because we have eyes of our own and we are busy scraping barnacles off our grandfathers' graves, and other headstones drowned at high tide. This is absolutely existential for us. And I just remember being really pissed off at that conference and then, personally talking to the activists afterward. But all these young people, are just putting their, like Greta has made her whole life an emergency, but also all these young activists like Kathy Jetler Kitchener from the Marshall Islands and just a slew of others all over the world, are, putting their whole lives on the line for this. I mean, and it's very personal.
Christiana, I sometimes think of a story that you once told about a visit to a glacier, I think in Switzerland, and the impact that it had on you. I wonder in what way is climate change personal for you?
It's very personal. I haven't thought about that story, in a while. I'm happy to
Do you want to tell it?
Sure, I'm happy to share it. It came at the end of my first term as head of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the then Secretary General had asked me if I would accept another 3-year term. And this was 2013. And we were, motors were getting warm toward an eventual agreement, but we still didn't have too much specificity on it. And I honestly didn't know. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether I should do another 3 years and take us all the way through to the agreement or not. And I was thinking about all of this, and by, the universe works in interesting ways. I had invited my sister, who lives here in Costa Rica and had never seen a glacier. I invited her to Switzerland for a trip, and I told her I would really like you to see a glacier. And so we went up in the gondola, and I was there with my sister and my brother. And the gondola doors opened, and I had been to that glacier several years before. The gondola doors opened, and I saw brown rocks. And I could almost not step out of the gondola. I finally stepped out, and I fell to the ground, and I went, oh my God. Yes, I do have to work at least 3 years more. This is so unacceptable, so unacceptable.
That's very powerful. Thank you for that. Can this panel, the title of it is, Should Capitalism Survive Climate Change? I want to invite any of you are free to answer this. I'd like to hear your theory of the case, if you will. Should capitalism survive climate change? If so, how? If not, what needs to take its place exactly? And I can see you rearing to go, so please be the first one.
It's such a very big question, and it's also fascinating. Right now, capitalism, if you like, has been suspended. It's not actually functioning. It's not actually operating as capitalism right now. The shock that was the pandemic caused society worldwide to suspend capitalism as we know it. And capitalism as it now operates is actually being kept, it's like a semi-comatose body that's being kept alive by the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan. The central banks are pumping in liquidity to keep this semi-comatose body alive. But it's not functioning properly anymore. And without the liquidity provided by publicly financed institutions, taxpayer-backed institutions, God knows what would happen. So we have that happening on the one hand with the Federal Reserve pumping up the semi-comatose body. And then we have governments with job protection schemes and so on, furlough schemes, pumping up another part of the body. But the body is almost lifeless, really. Now the question becomes, if we get over this shock, and I doubt we will, we will before we have to face another shock, because the fact about this shock is a consequence of climate breakdown. It's not isolated from it. It's a consequence of us mining and farming and investing and industrializing whole areas of nature and stripping, if you like, wildlife of its habitats. And in that process, we are going to generate more pandemics. There are apparently 30 diseases in the pipeline, according to experts. So this is already a climate shock, and there are going to be more shocks. And if this semi-comatose system, which we call capitalism, has to be kept on life support by public resources, if it does survive this process, it has to be a very, very different body. It has to be a very different animal. And the question is, what will that be?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, to be fair, there's no direct attribution of the coronavirus, COVID-19, to climate change per se. But I think what you're referring to is the destruction of natural habitats that could lead to and have led to disease transmissions in the past. The other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that some of the parties that are responsible for the largest shares of greenhouse gas emissions are not necessarily private companies answerable to private shareholders, but in fact, they are state-owned companies. Some of the largest coal mining companies, the coal-fired power plant developers, and crucially, the financiers are state-owned. And sometimes, as Christiana Figueres, you've pointed out, taxpayers are putting in their money into propping up some of these fossil fuel interests. So I wonder, for you, Christiana Figueres, what is your theory of the case? Should capitalism survive climate change? If so, how? And if not, what can take its place?
Well, it's an interesting question right now. It's a very timely question, because we're coming up on the 75th anniversary of Milton Friedman's theory that he posed about capitalism being for the purpose of the benefit of shareholders exclusively. So shareholder capitalism was brought forward by Milton Friedman, and honestly, capitalism, or in fact, the whole economy, because capitalism is just one way of functioning. But for those countries in which the economy has been following capitalism, and not every country has, we have definitely been following, by and large, Milton Friedman's theory and his guidance. What I think is very exciting is that we have realized, perhaps 70 years too late, but now, definitely this year, as we come up on the 75th anniversary, that shareholder capitalism can no longer function. It is just not going to be a capitalism, or those entities in the economy, let's say companies that function like that, will not have business continuity into this century. And so the alternative that is coming up is stakeholder capitalism, which is a short term to denote the fact that especially corporations need to not give up their profit, because they would then not be companies anymore. But what they have to give up is the sole purpose being profit. And they have to move toward a triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. In that order: people, planet, and profit. People meaning they have to be part of the social inequality solution that is the most urgent right now. Planet means they have to be part of the regeneration solution that would address climate change and biodiversity. And then, of course, they will have profit, because that's what private companies do. But what I find very exciting is, A, that we collectively have identified the alternative to shareholder capitalism, that there is clarity around it. And what I find most exciting is the number of CEOs of very large companies that have really discovered this for themselves. And they're making those changes within their companies. And they're doing so because they know that's the only route to business continuity, but they're also doing it because they know that's the only way to get smart brains of young people who are coming out of universities and colleges to work for them, because young people no longer want to work for irresponsible companies. So if they want to be competitive in the hiring world, they have to put people, planet, and profit at the same level of their purpose.
So I'm hearing you say that the CEOs of many private companies, not all, have read the room. They know what's coming, and they need to adapt in order to remain accountable to their shareholders and their people, their employees.
Well, not just to their shareholders and employees, to their clients, to
consumers.
I'm sorry, but the word consumer sends off all kinds of little, warning signals to me. So, to clients, but to citizens, every single company has the responsibility to benefit the world for all citizens, independently of whether citizen A, B, and C buys from that company or not. They have the responsibility to benefit the conditions under which all citizens live. And there are some CEOs, not all, but there are some that are beginning to understand that and are making radical transformations in their companies, accelerated, by the way, by COVID-19.
Julian, did you have anything to add to that? Because I wanted to follow up on what Christiana said, but please, the floor is yours.
Oh no, you can go first if you like. No, I just have a different take on the question. I think we just take a huge step back. I just think it's absolutely necessary to say that this current economic system is literally at war with life forms on Earth. I mean, there's just no way around it. I mean, this is just so extreme at this point. Just how clear I think so much of the world is getting on the fact that we need an entirely new system predicated on an entirely new set of values, about how, one that's not about primarily endless extraction, but about, different kinds of values and like deep reciprocity, for example, reciprocity and respect, mutual respect for the Earth and for each other. I mean, that's why I'm really excited about initiatives like Progressive International, the Global Green New Deal. I mean, it's just like a star map that's out there now. And we can all sort of check our positions against that star map, I was reading a book recently by Aurora Levins-Morales, who actually wrote so beautifully about this. And she was like, climate change is so huge, right? But it's this huge crisis is just this huge opportunity, to be bolder, to dream bigger. And I mean that in a really practical sense. I believe thinking big in this way and having a big goal, almost like a North Star, really is like helpful for mass movement, the building of people power. I think it's super helpful. And it helps us all sort of like not throw anyone overboard for the sake of little gain, but instead develop a robust as hell set of solidaristic practices, and that's the answer.
Julian, what you said about endless extraction reminds me that, in fact, the endless extraction of natural resources has not been the sole province of strictly capitalist countries. Communist nations and socialist nations have likewise engaged in that, what you call the endless extraction of the Earth's resources for what they called development.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
and actually, go ahead, Anne.
Please, Anne, yes.
No, but the point is that you're absolutely right, that there are big state-owned industries that are, are burning coal, emitting emissions, and do not have stakeholder concerns, as Christiana's argued. They are not stakeholder-oriented either. But I think the really key point is this, that they're operating within a capitalist system which rewards exploitation and extraction. And what worries me is that it's bad enough that capitalism is rewarding extraction of the Earth's finite assets and behaving as if those assets are not finite. But there is there's financial capitalism, and that financial capitalism is invisible. We don't see it. It's not very visible. And that demands a rate of extraction even higher than state capitalist institutions do or private capitalist institutions do. A rate of return on which we call interest on finance requires that you strip Brazil's forests to repay your debt, you fish the seas to repay debts, all of this has to happen in order to satisfy that monster, which is the global financial system, which operates independently of states, independently of society, and almost independently of the ecosystem. And of course, that's not sustainable. That isn't going to be sustained. But they have carried on as if before. And I mean, right through this pandemic, I'm a South African. I was born in South Africa. I'm watching South Africa very carefully. This is a country with very poor health system, very large numbers of poor people, with very high numbers of unemployed people, deliberately unemployed, because capitalism thinks the cost of labor is a cost that has to always be diminished. And so we must diminish labor. So there's very high levels of unemployed. The minute the pandemic was announced, capital flooded out of South Africa, crashed her currency, increased the value of the dollar. If she wanted to import pharmaceuticals, which she had to, they became immediately more expensive because of this imbalance in currencies and so on. Now, that is something. South Africa may be incompetent, it may be communist, it may be whatever, but actually these are forces beyond the control of those governments. And they have to face something as serious as a pandemic or as cataclysmic as, climate breakdown. Oh, and biodiversity loss. So I just feel we need to understand these forces are really very powerful, and there ain't no stakeholders there.
Christiana, I want to ask you about something that we have been hearing about for years and years in different countries, and that is the carbon tax. There's long been a huge debate over a carbon tax. It is, of course, not part of the Green New Deal. You've heard the arguments. Sort of explain a little bit what that debate is about, please. What is wrong or objectionable about a carbon tax, and what are the proponents saying about why it is a effective or efficient instrument for the climate crisis?
Yeah, happily not an easy thing to summarize, but just before I go there, Samini, if I could just react to Anne, because while I do take on many of your points, and I would also argue that we have to be open to tiny little shoots of enlightenment that I begin to see in the global financial system. So I'm just give you two examples of things beginning to change. If you look at market behavior over the past 6 to 8 months during which we've had COVID, it is those companies that are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, those companies that have put people, planet into their corporate strategies and that are actually operating out of a high social and environmental positive impact platform. Those are the ones that perform much better in the markets, i.e. the capital markets are actually rewarding them. That's example number one. Example number two, which is quite compelling, is British Petroleum, one of the largest oil and gas companies, on the 4th of August announced that they were going to leave 40% of the oil and gas reserves that they own. They're going to leave them in the ground. They're not going to extract them. And they're going to use their capital, their operating, or rather their risk, not their operating capital, their risk capital, they're actually going to invest in renewable energy. What happened to the share value of BP the next day? It went up by 7%. So very interesting, right? Because one would have said, well, a company, as old and as attached to extractive industry as BP, if they sort of turn around and say, we're going to pursue a new business model, they will actually be punished by the global financial system. Not true. They were actually rewarded. So that is not the case everywhere. I take your point, but I think we have to be open to seeing tiny little shoots of hope that are beginning to come up here in the garden of life.
Can I just say that I really agree with you about that? And I mean, for me, these are big industrial companies, and if you think of people like Paul Polson and the work he's done, I think in many cases, these big companies are in advance of many governments, and we are cheered up by that, And I think that the green movement, as broad as you may want to call it, should align itself with those corporations, because you're right. But they're just a section of, if you like, capitalist corporations. The ones I worry about are the ones that we don't see, the intangible ones, the financial system. But I agree with you about that.
Just don't want me to go to the price. So first of all,
very quickly.
Carbon price is actually what we should be concerned about, whether it comes through a tax system, which is in some countries operative, or whether it comes through a cap and trade. Two different ways to come at a carbon price, but that is what we want to work at, and every country can choose which way to do it. The reason why having a price on carbon is helpful is because basically what it does is put a price on pollution. That's what we should be putting a price on. If you're polluting, you should pay for it. And that will give you a very good incentive to bring your pollution down. If we don't price carbon, then there is no financial incentive for you to control your emissions, which is global pollution and is also local pollution. because it is the burning of fossil fuels that is actually killing 7 million people prematurely around the world because of lung diseases. So we should put a price on that. We should put a price on that. Now, there are some countries, in fact, there are 60 jurisdictions around the world that already have some kind of a carbon price, but it should not be just 60 jurisdictions. There should be a universal carbon price in order to align financial incentives and make very sure that if you as a company or as a government, whatever, if you want to continue polluting, then you better pay very expensively for that. And I bet you that the higher that we go on a carbon price, and many of us argue that the price of carbon should be north of $100 a ton. It's now about $5 a ton. If it were north of $100 a ton, we would really cut down on that darn pollution.
I mean, I think the next piece to watch on that is the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism. I think I've got the term right. And the big question is whether in the post-pandemic rebuilding discussions, whether that carbon border adjustment piece will take a back seat or whether that will continue. I think there's going to be a really pretty intense debate to follow in the European Union on that. COVID, and this sort of leads to my next question. You know, COVID has really lifted the lid on so many inequities in all of our societies in such a way that it is impossible to sort of turn your gaze, right, from it. I wonder if you are witnessing on the part of governments or on the part of companies, any evidence of a different way of doing business, whether that's in literally business practices or if it's in the stimulus packages, in the in the economic reconstruction packages. Christiane, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, the region that is taking a lead on this is the European Union, as they usually do in the absence of the United States. It used to be the United States that took the lead on these issues, but in the absence of the United States, it's the European Union that has been taking the lead. And they have already approved a green recovery package that is going to help companies that are practically bankrupt as long as they create jobs and change their business plans to be more climate friendly. So, that's what they call green strings attached. And so they will get money from the government in order to bring back those industries. But they have to do so in a responsible way. And it's actually very critical because we collectively, the world has already gathered $12 trillion in recovery packages that have already been allotted, and it's very possible we're going to go to $20 trillion. We've never had that much capital injected into the economy, and certainly not over 18 months, which is what's going to happen here. So the recovery packages have to be green because though $20 trillion injected into the economy is going to determine the structure and the carbon intensity of the economy, not for 18 months, but for decades. And hence, we are now in the amazing position of being able to address the economic recovery and climate change and biodiversity and inequality all at the same time. We can actually make the solutions converge if those recovery packages are responsible and are well thought through. If not, we're in serious trouble.
The big question is the big if that you just pointed out, because of that 12 trillion, those are a lot of zeros, and I'm not sure, to how many zeros green strings are attached. In fact, even in the European Union, if I understand correctly, there are some strings attached to those green strings, and there are some countries, who are part of the economic recovery package, who don't have to get off coal anytime soon. And did you have something to add to that?
Yes, I wanted to say this, that, I think I agree with Christina that it's the European Union that's taking the lead here. But there is going to be some really massive challenges. The European Union has just been defeated by its own court over the question of whether it can retrieve $13 billion in taxes from Apple. Right. So Apple is able to shift its profits out of the European Union and into a member state, Ireland, which is effectively a tax haven, and so evade, if you like, the taxation system of the European Union. And in those circumstances, it makes it very, very hard for governments to finance recovery packages and to maintain the stability of their public finances if they can't, for example, collect taxes from the big corporations making enormous profits within their domain. And that is the problem. We live in a world of mobile capital, which enables people to avoid taxes. And I can assure you that they'll try and avoid carbon taxes as well.
Julian, did you want to add something?
I do, actually, and I don't mean to be disrespectful at all. I'm just trying to figure out, it's really hard. I'm not exactly bubbling over with excitement about a conversation about carbon taxes. I mean, and to the extent that they may or may not sort of be part of a larger battery of progressive sort of initiatives as we transition to renewables is a separate question. But I believe there's much more fundamental question. I believe in sort of like taking the conversation to much bigger places. I just feel like there's nothing more powerful than values-based argument. We're not going to win this. We're not going to convince people. I'm not sorry to bring up yet another author and yet another book, but it is a book festival. So Sandra Cisneros, in her sort of updated version of her beautiful classic, The House on Mango Street, actually said a really powerful line that startled me into writing my own book, actually. And it was, the world we live in is a house on fire, and everyone we love is burning. And this is sort of that urgency that we need. And we need to sort of like win back the popular imagination. And we're not going to do it this way. We're going to do it by showing people that there's so much to gain from designing another kind of economic system that's based on another set of values. I mean, I think there's a really, and to get to your other question, actually, you didn't ask me directly, but I'll just say, COVID-19 and the coronavirus crisis has laid bare all of these inequalities. Mm-hmm. Just yesterday, last night, the U.S. Defense Secretary, Esper, was here on Guam, an American colony, also known as an unincorporated territory. And the U.S. Defense Secretary was here last night meeting with the Japanese Defense Secretary. It's almost as if and of course, Guam wasn't at the table, and Guam is never at the table because we are an actual colony. And that's what this looks like. If the great game is afoot between these countries, Guam is the sort of the field upon which that game is played. We are not players in the game, we're spectators, but it's our lives on the line. It really is. I mean, for everything from North Korea pointing nuclear weapons and threatening us because we're a US territory. I mean, coronavirus, literally, there's even a missile now named Guam Killer. Do you know that? Guam Killer. And we are told by Homeland Security that we have roughly 14 minutes to sort of steel ourselves for the possibility of oblivion, because that's how many minutes it would take for a North Korean missile to reach Guam. And all of the provocation, all of the war games that are afoot right here, right now, and our COVID-19 rate has just skyrocketed. In the last 3 weeks alone, our infection rate has increased some 360%. In large part because the military is also not even being transparent with the government of Guam about how many COVID cases they have. And it's not just Guam, it's Okinawa too. I mean, Suzuyo Takazato, an amazing activist in Okinawa, has actually laid bare all of these other sort of rash, this slew of sort of violent attacks. I mean, just women being raped and, or thrown into the river. I mean, these things are all happening. And even in Okinawa, the military's proceeding with impunity. They're also not sharing their COVID-19 infection rates. In Hawaii, there's massive war games going on in RIMPAC, and despite widespread community opposition. So what we're facing is so much bigger. It's a world, the world is a house, is on fire, is a house on fire, and the people we love are burning. That's the quote that I keep thinking about in this conversation.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I want to, before I go to the audience questions, I want to throw out a quick one to you about that relates to COVID. Certainly, we are all discovering in this time that there are a lot of trade-offs we're being asked to make. Should schools open? And if they do, should bars and restaurants also open? There are personal trade-offs, there are community trade-offs, there are big government trade-offs that the coronavirus is compelling us to think about. And I wonder if any of you, because we really just have 2 minutes left, if any of you see a parallel to getting out of the climate crisis. What are the trade-offs that are required in this roadmap?
I want to say that I do, and I want to echo what Julian is saying, that the house is on fire, but there is hope. And my book, which is The Case for the Green New Deal, argues that actually we know we can do this transformation because we've done it in the past. And we did it at a time of catastrophe in the 1930s then, too. Maybe not as serious as it is now. So there is possibility. And what COVID has shown is exactly what you say, that these trade-offs, these alternatives have been made visible. So what I have found in my community is an extraordinary sense of mutual cooperation, of people coming out to look after each other in ways we wouldn't expect. I've found that the government has stepped in when we wouldn't have expected the government. I found that the government, for example, ensured that all homeless people were found somewhere to live. And what that demonstrates is that we can do this. It's all entirely practical. It's all entirely within human will. And we've done it before. We can do it again. So I'm really hopeful. And I think COVID, for all that's been awful about it, it has shown the possibilities of that alternative that Julian is wanting us to talk about. It has shown that we can be different, and that's very exciting.
I would really like to move quickly on to the questions from the audience, but Christiana, did you have something to add about the trade-offs that we may have to make in order to address climate change, to have a future in the era of climate change?
Well, I would definitely agree with Anne's sentiment about the many positive lessons that we can derive from COVID. And I think underlying it all is the choice that we have to make, which is a choice in COVID, but also a choice for climate change. How are we ultimately going to address this? Yes, we're all now locked up at home, but that's only phase one. The fact is that in order to be able to go back to any degree of normal, if there ever is going to be any degree of normal again, we have to get out and we have to have a vaccine. And to have a vaccine where that's not going to be something that can be done individually. In fact, certainly not by people individually or by countries individually. It is going to have to be a global collaborative effort to develop the vaccine and to get it to 7 billion people. Same thing for climate. We can all contribute a little bit in our own homes on reducing emissions, but if we do not collaborate globally across all borders, because we're all human, we're all part of the same family, and what happens exactly on the other side of the world happens to me too, even if I don't know those people, because we're all part of the same human system, the same planetary system. And so we have to get that into our minds. We have to be able to see these interconnections. And I'm hoping that COVID is going to help us to do that.
There's a related question that has come in from an audience member who points out that earlier in the festival, Frans Timmermans said, who is the EU vice president in overseeing the European Union's Green
Deal
and Green Deal, right? Yeah. It's not the Green New Deal; it's the Green Deal in the EU. Yeah. So this audience member points out that he pointed out that we need to reframe the climate rhetoric from "save the planet" to "save the people," as the planet will be able to go on in some fashion. Do you agree that this would be a more effective framing, that this is not about saving the planet, but saving people?
I have to jump in here because I feel very passionate about that. It is so true. The fact is the planet has been around for 4.5 billion years, and the planet will continue for probably as long as that, with or without us, because we weren't necessary at the beginning. In fact, we're not necessary at all. We are visitors on this planet. We only just arrived a couple of tens of thousands of years ago. That's it. And so it is really about, do we want the planet evolved into a sweet spot of environmental conditions in the previous period, the previous geological period? It evolved into a sweet spot that allowed for human propagation. We have now catapulted ourselves out of that, out of the Holocene into the Anthropocene. We're in a completely different geological era that we have created, we humans. And the question now is, are we humans going to develop the empathy, the compassion, the wisdom to have an Anthropocene that it actually plays itself out for the well-being of people and planet? Or are we actually going to evolve ourselves away from the planet? But the planet will continue with or without us. Yes, with very different conditions, whatever you want. But this is not about saving the planet at all. This is about saving the environmental conditions that allowed humans to prosper and propagate.
One of our audience members asks, relatedly, is there a future for the Paris Agreement if President Trump is reelected in November? Who wants to take that?
I can definitely take that, but I don't want to take all the questions. So I'm hoping my friends will take others. It's a very difficult future for the Paris Agreement if he's reelected. Definitely difficult. It's not difficult for the Paris Agreement because the long list of countries that have announced that they're going to leave the Paris Agreement remains at one, the United States. So it's not like, all of a sudden the Paris Agreement is going to fall away. What is difficult is to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement, to get to stabilization levels, to get to 1/2 of global emissions by 2030, which is what science demands that we do, and to a zero emitting economy by 2050. That will be very complicated because the United States is the largest economy and is a pretty heavy emitter. Now, having said that, the fact is that there are many companies, upwards of 300, and many of the largest states in the United States that are decarbonizing, despite whatever the White House says, because they know it's good for them. But 4 more years of the Trump administration could wreak a lot of damage.
To state the obvious, the United States is history's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, making it imperative on the US to make the reductions to reach that target that you just said. And I just want to put that out there. What the scientists say must happen is have emissions by 2030, go to zero by 2050. It's not a lot of time. There are 2 related questions that are really interesting. One is, do you believe a just transition is possible for workers given the time pressures we're faced with? And what do you see as the most important green jobs of the future? That might be my favorite question. That's a really great question that I should have asked. So who wants to take that? Is a just transition possible for workers given the time pressures we're faced with? And what will be the most important green jobs of the future? Julian, Anne?
So I'd like to take that. I think absolutely. I think
absolutely what? That a green transition is possible. A just transition is possible.
Is possible, and it
okay.
And for it to be possible, it has to be labor intensive. We have, in a sense, to substitute labor for fossil fuels. You know, we're going to have to get out of our cars and onto our bicycles. We're going to have to learn to grow our own green beans, in what I think. But more importantly, we're going to have to transform our energy, transport, and land use systems. And those are huge systems that have to be transformed, as you say, by 2030, effectively. So to transform our energy system away from fossil fuels into renewables, you know, that's going to take a lot of investment and a lot of work, real hard work. The same with transport. You know, we're going to have to learn to move around in different ways. And similarly with land use and agriculture. And all of those changes are going to require workers. And so for me, you know, for the earth, for the planet to become sustainable, for us to survive as humanity, it's going to have to be labor intensive. It's going to have to be a just transition.
Julian, do you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I totally agree that it has to be, that it's possible but necessary. I mean, you know, I mean, that's sort of the spirit that animates the Green New Deal, and I think that's why it's able to sort of attract so much support. I think people are able to see that we need to think bigger now, and we need to do this. And the only way to do it is to focus, for example, on a just transition, make sure that we don't leave out any of the groups that were originally left out, the original New Deal, you know, in the wake of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. I mean, and there's so many, there's really specific, I even love that they include Indigenous peoples in there. I think, and that relates to your other question. Actually, I believe like part of like what needs to be sort of recalculated is just how you, and recalibrated is how you sort of count what water protectors are doing, what Indigenous land defenders are doing. I mean, like, you know, blocking pipelines from, you know, being like, they're trying to keep everything, what's left in the ground. I mean, those are green jobs. I mean, those are, we need to find a way to sort of account for, we know a lot about taking, we know very little about caretaking, you know, and Indigenous peoples know a hell of a lot about caretaking. And I think we need to find a way to really sort of place them front and center in our sort of new vision, you know, for the way forward.
There's a really great question that will be the last audience question that gets at the inequity, the disparity between countries and regions, and I would add within countries as well. Climate change really is one of the most profound inequities among countries and among people in a given country. I was just in California last week reporting on agricultural laborers who are dealing with the heat wave that is moving through California right now, plus the smoke from the wildfires, plus, of course, the inequitable impact of the coronavirus. So the question, I'm going to rephrase this a little bit. What are your views on what are the best ways to tackle this fundamental inequity? Those who have the least, those who are least responsible for climate change, for putting emissions into the atmosphere, are precisely those who are suffering some of the greatest impacts. Is there a fix or three fixes? Who wants to take that? Julian?
Oh God. I just being here in the Pacific, I mean, just yesterday, a news article came out in The Guardian about how in Papua New Guinea, in remote villages, including in the highlands, you know, they're talking about fighting off COVID, but they're dealing with such, I mean, so many other sort of simultaneous health crises. You know, they can't even fight COVID-19 because they don't have such a lack of access to clean water. I mean, these are really fundamental things. I mean, the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, some of these island nations sit like just 2 meters above sea level. I mean, sea level rise is so real and it's such an existential threat, you know? And so we need to find a way, a much better way of sort of bringing in the voices from the margin to the center. You know, we need to do what legal scholar Mari Matsuda calls looking to the bottom, you know, elevating the voices of exactly those populations and those groups. And I believe, for example, that we should, and you know, our countries are also doing pretty well. I mean, the Marshall Islands is punching way above its weight and in the global climate change negotiations, but we need to do that. We need to take our cue from the people and the communities on the front lines and support them, but allow them to to tell us what it is that they want and need. The whole climate adaptation, for example, conversation needs to be fundamentally recalibrated.
I mean, civil society groups from the Global South have long been calling for essentially some form of reparations, loss and damage. Of course, those calls have gone nowhere as yet, and let's see what the next round of negotiations under the Paris Agreement will bring. We are almost to the end of our session, but I want to do a really, really quick lightning round. I'm going to give you just one word. Actually, it's a number. And I'd love to hear what comes up for you. You ready? 2050. Christiana.
Stabilization.
Anne.
Zero emissions.
Julian.
A North Star.
Thank you all so much for your engagement, for your generosity, and for having this wonderful conversation with us. Before I sign off, I must remind our audience that this is the Edinburgh International Book Festival. There is a bookshop, and you can find that at shop.edbookfest.co.uk. The panelists' books are available there. And if you can, your support for the Edinburgh International Book Festival will make future programs like this possible. So if you can, please donate. Thank you so much. And everyone, be well. Take care.
Thank you, Samini. Goodbye, Anne. Bye, Julian. Thanks.
Goodbye, and thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you.